2006. MySpace is king. Flip phones are the height of technology, and suburban life in upstate New York hums along quietly. Rows of tidy houses with white picket fences line the streets, where kids ride bikes and neighbors wave hello. But behind one of those perfectly kept doors lies a story that's far from picture-perfect. Rachel Carter sits at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. The faint scent of freshly baked muffins fills the air as she watches her two kids bicker over who gets the last one. She looks the part of the content housewife, sweater neatly pressed, her blonde hair pulled into a ponytail, but her eyes betray a restlessness that refuses to fade. Across the room, her husband, Mark, adjusts his tie. He's already running late but grabs a muffin on his way out. His kiss lands on Rachel's cheek, perfunctory and quick, as he mutters something about a meeting he can't miss. The front door clicks shut behind him. Rachel doesn't even bother to say goodbye. As the kids rush off to school, Rachel's day unfolds with the same predictability it always does. She tidies up the kitchen, goes for a run, and stops by the gym for her morning workout. It's here at the local fitness center where she first crosses paths with Ethan Walker. Ethan, the new trainer in town, has an energy about him that's hard to ignore. With dark hair, sharp features, and a confident smile, he's quickly become the talk of the gym. Rachel catches him in the corner of her eye as she adjusts the settings on the treadmill. He's chatting with another client, flashing that easy charm of his. The next day, Rachel arrives at the gym a little earlier than usual. Ethan is at the front desk sorting through papers. Their eyes meet for a brief second. He offers her a smile, one that lingers just a little too long. Rachel feels a strange flutter in her chest, something she hasn't felt in years. She brushes it off and heads to the weight machines. By the third visit, Ethan strikes up a conversation. He's approachable, casual, but there's a hint of something more in his tone. They talk about fitness routines, their favorite exercises, and soon their chats become a regular part of Rachel's mornings. For the first time in ages, she finds herself looking forward to something. A fleeting interaction that makes her days feel a little less routine. At home, Mark is oblivious to Rachel's changing demeanor. His days are consumed by work, and his nights are filled with spreadsheets and conference calls. Even when he's home, his mind is elsewhere. Rachel doesn't blame him, but the growing distance between them feels impossible to ignore. One evening, as Rachel folds laundry in the living room, Mark finally notices something's off. He asks if she's okay, his voice tinged with concern. Rachel hesitates, her hands pausing mid-fold, but she brushes off his question with a simple "I'm fine." Mark nods, satisfied, and turns back to the television. The truth is, Rachel isn't fine. She feels trapped, stuck in a cycle of mundane routines and unmet needs. Ethan, with his easy confidence and undivided attention, feels like a lifeline she didn't know she needed. Their conversations at the gym start to linger, stretching out longer with each passing day. Ethan is careful, never crossing any obvious lines, but there's an undeniable chemistry between them. Weeks pass, and Rachel begins to find excuses to stay longer at the gym. She starts taking personal training sessions with Ethan, justifying the extra cost as an investment in herself. Mark doesn't question it. In fact, he barely notices. During one session, Ethan jokes about her form on the leg press. Rachel laughs, a genuine, carefree laugh that surprises even her. She realizes she hasn't laughed like that in months, maybe even years. One Friday afternoon, as Rachel finishes her workout, Ethan hands her a water bottle and leans in slightly. His voice drops just enough to make her heart skip. "You're doing great," he says. "I can tell you're really committed." Rachel mutters a thank you, her cheeks flushing. For the rest of the day, she can't stop replaying the moment in her head. That evening, while Mark works late, Rachel sits alone at the kitchen table. Her phone buzzes. A notification from the gym's app. It's a message from Ethan, thanking her for her dedication and saying he looks forward to their next session. It's nothing inappropriate, just friendly enough to toe the line. Rachel stares at the screen for a moment before replying with a quick, polite response. But the thrill of it lingers long after she sets her phone down. Rachel couldn't help but notice the small ways her routine started revolving around Ethan. She found herself double-checking her gym outfit, making sure her hair looked just right before stepping out the door. Their conversations grew more personal, slowly chipping away at the polite walls they had kept up. Ethan shared anecdotes about his life, how he'd moved to New York to start fresh, how he'd always felt drawn to people who were a little lost. Rachel, in turn, opened up about her own struggles, though she framed them carefully. Frustrations with parenting, the loneliness of Mark's long hours, and the monotony of suburban life. "You ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" she asked one morning after a session. Ethan tilted his head, considering. "I think everyone does at some point. Question is, are you okay with that? Or do you want something different?" The words lingered with her long after she left the gym. They weren't judgmental, just a reflection of what she already knew deep down. But as her emotional connection with Ethan grew stronger, so did her guilt. She'd done nothing wrong, yet. Still, she found herself avoiding eye contact with Mark at dinner, brushing off his attempts to engage in conversation. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Mark decided to surprise Rachel by coming home early. His arrival startled her. She hadn't expected him for hours. He walked into the kitchen to find her staring at her phone, a small smile playing on her lips. "Who's that?" he asked casually. Rachel fumbled with her phone, quickly locking the screen. "Oh, just the group chat from the gym. We're sharing recipes." Mark raised an eyebrow, but he didn't press the issue. He had no reason to doubt her, but something about her flustered reaction stayed with him. Meanwhile, Rachel's interactions with Ethan were becoming harder to justify as innocent. During a late afternoon session, she complained about Mark's work schedule, her voice tinged with frustration. Ethan listened intently, his gaze steady and empathetic. "Sounds like you've got a lot on your plate," he said. "You ever take time just for yourself?" Rachel hesitated. "I mean, the gym is kind of my me time." "Good," Ethan replied, his voice soft but firm. "You deserve that. You deserve more than that." The comment hit Rachel harder than she expected. Ethan wasn't saying anything revolutionary, but the way he said it made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. Mark wasn't oblivious, even if he wasn't confrontational. Over the next few weeks, he started paying closer attention to Rachel's habits. She seemed happier, almost glowing some days, but there was a guardedness to her that hadn't been there before. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Mark leaned over and asked, "Is everything okay? You've seemed distant lately." Rachel forced a laugh. "I'm fine, really. Just tired, I guess." But Mark wasn't convinced. He didn't press further, though, instead choosing to watch and wait. The real shift came on a chilly November morning. Rachel had just finished her workout, her cheeks flushed and her pulse still racing. As she grabbed her water bottle, Ethan approached her with a casual smile. "Hey, a few of us are getting together this weekend," he said. "Just a little gathering. Nothing fancy. You should come." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to say no, to shut down the idea immediately, but her hesitation was all the answer Ethan needed. "It's not a big deal," he added quickly. "Just some friends hanging out. You deserve to have some fun." Rachel nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." When she got home, the invitation weighed heavily on her mind. She knew what it could mean, even if Ethan hadn't said it outright. It wasn't just some friends hanging out. It was something more. That weekend, Rachel made up an excuse to leave the house. Mark, however, wasn't buying it. As she left, he decided to dig a little deeper. Rachel had left her laptop open, and Mark hesitated before opening her email. What he found wasn't damning, just a confirmation for a personal training session. But it was enough to make his stomach churn. Something was off. He could feel it at Ethan's place. The atmosphere was warm and inviting. Rachel arrived, her nerves jangling as she stepped through the door. Ethan greeted her with a hug, his hand lingering just a moment longer than necessary. The room was filled with strangers, all laughing and chatting, but Rachel felt like the air was charged with something unspoken. Ethan stayed close to her throughout the evening, his attention unwavering. He introduced her to his friends, kept her drink full, and made her feel like the center of the universe. It was intoxicating and terrifying. When she left that night, her mind was spinning. She hadn't crossed any lines, but she felt like she was teetering on the edge of a precipice. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear how it unfolds, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Your support means everything, and subscribing ensures you won't miss the next chapter in this gripping tale. Rachel's life began to feel like a delicate balancing act. On the surface, everything seemed normal: morning workouts, errands, dinner with the family. But internally, she was a mess. Her connection with Ethan had grown into something she couldn't ignore. She told herself it was harmless, that nothing physical had happened, but the emotional pull was undeniable. Mark, meanwhile, had grown increasingly suspicious. Rachel's excuses were becoming flimsier, her explanations more vague. Late one night, while she was in the shower, he picked up her phone, his hands shaking as he navigated to her messages. What he found wasn't explicit. No damning confessions or incriminating photos, but the tone of her exchanges with Ethan was enough to confirm his fears. "You deserve so much more. I'm always here for you. Can't wait to see you again." Mark felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He set the phone down and left the room, unable to face her when she stepped out of the bathroom. The next morning, Mark couldn't hold it in any longer. As Rachel poured coffee, he leaned against the counter, his jaw tight. "Who's Ethan?" he asked, his voice steady but cold. Rachel froze, the mug halfway to her lips. "What?" "You heard me," Mark said. "Who is he? And why are you texting him like that?" Rachel's mind raced. Denying it outright felt futile, but she wasn't ready to admit the full extent of her feelings. "He's just my trainer," she said quickly. "We talk about workouts and stuff. That's all." Mark's expression darkened. "Don't lie to me, Rachel. I saw the messages." Her cheeks flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You went through my phone? You left it unlocked," he shot back. "What was I supposed to think when you've been acting so different?" The room fell silent, the air between them heavy with unspoken accusations. Rachel spent the rest of the day in a haze. Guilt gnawed at her, but so did resentment. Mark had been distant for years, burying himself in work while she carried the weight of their home and family. Ethan had been the first person in ages to make her feel valued, seen. Was it really so wrong to crave that? Her mind kept returning to their last conversation at the gym. Ethan had leaned in close, his voice low. "You deserve someone who puts you first." The words had felt like a lifeline, but now they felt like a noose tightening around her neck. Later that week, Rachel found herself at the grocery store, wandering the aisles in a daze. She turned a corner and nearly collided with Ethan, who was holding a basket of produce. "Rachel," he said, his smile softening into concern. "You okay?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, not really. Want to talk about it?" They ended up in the parking lot, sitting in Ethan's car as the rain drummed softly against the roof. Rachel spilled everything. Mark's suspicions, the confrontation, her confusion about what she wanted. Ethan listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving hers. "I never meant to cause trouble," he said finally. "But I can't pretend I don't care about you." Rachel's heart pounded. She knew she was standing on the edge of a decision that could change everything at home. Mark's unease grew into anger. He replayed their confrontation in his mind, overanalyzing every word, every pause. That night, after Rachel went to bed, he did something he never thought he'd do. He followed her the next morning. He parked across the street from the gym, his pulse racing as he watched her car pull into the lot. When Ethan stepped outside to greet her, Mark felt his stomach drop. The way they smiled at each other, the way Rachel's posture shifted. It was clear there was more between them than workout advice. That evening, Mark confronted Rachel again, but this time, his anger boiled over. "Do you think I'm stupid?" he demanded. "I saw you with him, Rachel. You're not even trying to hide it anymore." Rachel's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Nothing happened, Mark. I swear. Nothing happened yet." he interrupted. But don't insult me by pretending there's nothing there. Rachel had no response. She knew he was right, but admitting it felt like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. Over the next few days, the tension in the house became unbearable. Mark barely spoke to her, and when he did, his words were clipped and cold. Rachel knew she had to make a choice. She couldn't keep straddling the line between two lives. She met Ethan one last time, this time in a quiet park where they wouldn't be seen. She explained through tears that she couldn't see him anymore, that her family had to come first. Ethan didn't argue. He simply nodded, his own pain evident. "I just want you to be happy," he said softly, "even if it's not with me." Rachel returned home that evening, emotionally drained. Mark was waiting for her in the living room, his expression unreadable. "Is it over?" he asked. "Yes," Rachel whispered. "It's over." For the first time in weeks, they sat down and talked, really talked, about their marriage, their struggles, and the ways they had both contributed to the distance between them. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was a start. Rachel spent the following days in a fog of uncertainty, torn between her lingering feelings for Ethan and the overwhelming guilt consuming her. Mark, too, was struggling, caught between his anger and a desperate desire to salvage their marriage. The house felt suffocating, filled with a silence heavier than any argument could have been. One evening, Mark came home early to find Rachel sitting on the edge of their bed, holding a box of old photographs. She had been going through them, staring at the smiling faces of their younger selves, trying to remember the joy that had once seemed so effortless. "We were happy once," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Mark stood in the doorway, his shoulders tense. "Were we? Or were we just pretending?" The question lingered in the air, unspoken truths pressing between them. Just as Rachel thought she had closed the chapter with Ethan, he reached out again. This time, it wasn't a casual text or a gym invitation. It was a direct question. "Are you really happy, Rachel? Or are you just scared of what leaving might mean?" The message was simple but struck like a lightning bolt. She knew Ethan wasn't trying to manipulate her. His words came from a place of genuine care, but they reopened wounds she was trying to heal. She didn't respond, but the question stayed with her, gnawing at her resolve. Mark's suspicions pushed him to dig deeper. One evening, while Rachel was out grocery shopping, he searched her desk and found a small, neatly folded note tucked between two books. It wasn't explicit, just a short message from Ethan, thanking Rachel for the incredible moments they'd shared. The words were vague but enough to confirm Mark's fears. This wasn't just emotional. Ethan had clearly crossed a line, and Rachel had let him. When Rachel returned home, Mark was waiting for her in the kitchen, the note in his hand. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice trembling with controlled fury. Rachel's face went pale. "Mark, it's not what you think. Don't lie to me again," he roared, slamming the note on the table. "You've been lying to me for weeks, Rachel. Do you have any idea what this has done to me? To us?" Tears streamed down Rachel's face, but she didn't try to defend herself. She knew there was nothing she could say to make it better. That night, Mark left the house. Rachel didn't know where he went, and for hours, she sat alone in the dark, staring at the front door. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Was he meeting with a lawyer? Confronting Ethan? Filing for divorce? When he finally returned, it was well past midnight. His face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot. "Do you love him?" he asked quietly. Rachel froze. The question was like a dagger to her heart. "No," she whispered. "I don't." "Then why, Rachel?" Mark's voice cracked, his composure finally breaking. "Why wasn't I enough?" Her response came in halting sobs. "I don't know. I was lonely. I felt invisible. I just wanted to feel like someone saw me again." The admission hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. For the first time in years, they were completely honest with each other. The next day, Rachel made a decision. She went to the gym early, catching Ethan before his first client arrived. When he saw her, his face lit up with a hopeful smile, but it quickly faded as she spoke. "This has to stop," she said. her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. I can't do this anymore. It's not fair to Mark. It's not fair to us. Ethan nodded slowly, his expression a mix of sadness and understanding. I get it, he said. But for what it's worth, Rachel, I think you deserve to be happy, whatever that looks like. Rachel didn't respond. She turned and walked out of the gym, leaving Ethan behind for good. At home, Rachel found Mark sitting at the dining room table, staring at his wedding ring. She sat across from him, her heart pounding in her chest. I ended it, she said softly. Mark didn't look up. What do you want me to do with that, Rachel? Pretend it never happened? Move on like nothing's changed? I don't know, she admitted. But I know I don't want to lose you. Mark finally raised his eyes to meet hers, the pain in his gaze cutting through her. I don't know if I can forgive you, Rachel. Not yet. But I don't want to lose you either. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. The weeks that followed were filled with long, painful conversations. Mark and Rachel began to unpack years of unspoken resentment, unmet expectations, and the ways they had both contributed to the rift in their marriage. It was messy and exhausting, but it also felt like progress. One evening, as they sat on the couch together, Rachel reached for Mark's hand. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark squeezed her hand gently. I know. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step closer. Mark spent sleepless nights wrestling with his emotions. The betrayal cut deep, and while Rachel's honesty had been a step toward mending their relationship, it wasn't enough to erase the hurt. Every time he looked at her, he saw fragments of the life they used to have, overshadowed by Ethan's lingering presence. But he wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Mark decided to take a leave of absence from work, something he hadn't done in years. He wanted to be home, to rebuild their connection and understand where things had gone wrong. When he told Rachel, she was taken aback. You're staying home? She asked, her voice cautious. Mark nodded. I think it's time I put us first, don't you? Mark's sudden presence at home was jarring. For years, their routines had revolved around his absence. Rachel running the house, managing the kids, and navigating her own emotions alone. Now, with Mark constantly around, every interaction felt fraught with unspoken tension. One morning, as Rachel packed lunches for the kids, Mark leaned against the counter, watching her. Do you still think about him? He asked suddenly. Rachel froze. Mark, I told you it's over. That's not what I asked, he said, his tone sharper than he intended. Rachel hesitated, then sighed. I think about what it meant, not him. I think about how I let things get that far. Her honesty stung, but Mark appreciated it. He nodded, though his jaw tightened as he tried to push the image of Ethan out of his mind. Rachel and Mark's progress felt like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. They started seeing a marriage counselor at Rachel's insistence, but the sessions often ended with more questions than answers. One evening, their counselor asked a question that hung heavily in the room. What do you both want from this marriage? Are you trying to rebuild it? Or are you holding on because it's familiar? The question forced them to confront their deepest fears. Rachel admitted she wanted to stay but wasn't sure she deserved forgiveness. Mark confessed he wanted to forgive but didn't know if he could trust her again. After the session, they sat in silence during the car ride home. Finally, Mark broke the quiet. Do you think we can fix this? Rachel's voice was soft but resolute. I think we owe it to ourselves to try. Just as Mark and Rachel began to find their footing, a storm hit, literally and figuratively. One rainy afternoon, Rachel walked into the grocery store and spotted Ethan in the produce aisle. Her stomach twisted in knots as their eyes met. Rachel, he said, his tone surprised but warm. It's been a while. She nodded, forcing a polite smile. It has. The conversation was brief but left Rachel rattled. She couldn't deny the emotions that resurfaced, but she also knew she couldn't let herself go down that road again. When she got home, Mark immediately sensed something was off. What happened? He asked. Rachel hesitated, then decided to tell him the truth. I saw Ethan at the store. Mark's face darkened. Did you talk to him? Just for a moment. It wasn't planned, she said quickly. I left as soon as I could. Mark's anger simmered, but he didn't lash out. Instead, he took a deep breath. I'm glad you told me, he said finally. Later that night, Mark sat alone in the living room, staring at their wedding photo. When Rachel joined him, she found him deep in thought. You know, he began, his voice low. I've spent so much time thinking about what you did, but I haven't really looked at what I didn't do. I let work consume me. I let you feel invisible. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. Mark, that's not an excuse for what I did. I made the choice to let it happen. But I didn't fight for you, Rachel. I just assumed we were fine, that you were fine. And I see now that I was wrong. It was the first time they had both truly acknowledged their roles in the breakdown of their marriage. The following weekend, Mark surprised Rachel with a plan to spend time together. A weekend getaway to a cabin they had rented in their early years of marriage. The gesture was small, but it was meaningful. During their trip, they revisited memories of the life they had built together. They laughed, cried, and talked late into the night, peeling back layers of resentment and rediscovering the bond that had brought them together in the first place. For the first time in months, Rachel felt hope. Not just for their marriage, but for herself. As the weekend at the cabin unfolded, Rachel and Mark's conversations delved deeper into the raw truths of their relationship. Each word felt like a thread, slowly untangling years of misunderstanding, guilt, and suppressed emotions. On the final night, a crackling fire illuminated the cabin as they sat on the worn-out couch. Rachel hesitated before speaking, her voice trembling. There's something I haven't told you. Mark's body stiffened. He met her eyes, his expression unreadable. What is it? Rachel took a deep breath. When this all started with Ethan, I wasn't just looking for attention. I was looking for something I thought I'd lost in us. And it scared me because I thought maybe it was gone forever. Mark's jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest. And now, Rachel blinked back tears. Now I realize it wasn't about Ethan. It was about me. I felt invisible, but instead of fighting for what we had, I looked for an escape. Her honesty stung, but it also struck a chord in Mark. He nodded slowly. I can't promise this will ever stop hurting, he said. But I can promise I'll fight for us if you will. The words hung in the air, fragile but full of hope. When they returned home, things seemed to be moving in the right direction. They were far from healed, but the weekend had given them a foundation to rebuild on. However, life rarely allows for clean resolutions. Rachel was at the grocery store a week later, picking up dinner ingredients, when she saw Ethan again. This time, he didn't smile or wave. Instead, he approached her, his expression serious. I've been trying to stay away, he said, his voice low. But I can't stop thinking about you. Rachel's stomach dropped. Ethan, we can't do this. I've made my choice. Have you, though? He pressed. Because the way you're looking at me right now, I don't think you're sure. Rachel felt a surge of anger. Not at Ethan, but at herself for ever letting things get this far. I am sure, she said firmly. This is over. Ethan's face fell, but he nodded. I hope he makes you happy, Rachel. The encounter left her shaken. When she got home, Mark immediately noticed something was off. Did something happen? He asked. Rachel hesitated, then told him the truth. I saw Ethan. He tried to reconnect, but I told him it's over. Mark's eyes darkened, but he simply nodded. Thank you for telling me. That evening, Mark and Rachel sat down for dinner with their children. For the first time in weeks, the atmosphere felt lighter. Laughter echoed through the dining room as they shared stories from their day. After the kids went to bed, Mark turned to Rachel. You know, when I said I'd fight for us, I wasn't sure I could trust you again. But tonight, I feel like we're finally on the same team. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. I won't let you down again, Mark. I promise. Mark reached across the table, taking her hand in his. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. Just as things seemed to be stabilizing, Rachel received a message that tested her resolve. It was from Ethan, a short but pointed note. I respect your decision, but if you ever change your mind, I'll be here. Rachel stared at the message for what felt like an eternity before deleting it. She blocked Ethan's number, knowing that keeping any connection to him would only jeopardize her marriage. When Mark asked her about her day that evening, she didn't mention the message. She felt it was better left unsaid, a moment she had faced and resolved on her own. In the weeks that followed, Mark and Rachel worked together to rebuild their relationship. They set aside time for weekly date nights, revisiting the places they had gone to when they first fell in love. They started cooking together, sharing quiet moments in the kitchen that reminded them of the partnership they had once had. But the most significant change was in their communication. They stopped avoiding difficult conversations, choosing instead to face them head-on. One night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mark turned to Rachel. "Do you think we'll ever feel like we did back then?" Rachel smiled softly. "I think we'll feel something better, because now we know what we almost lost." Life began to feel almost normal again for Rachel and Mark. Their routines were no longer about avoiding each other but finding moments of connection. The kids noticed the change, too, often commenting on how much happier their parents seemed. But just when it felt like they were on solid ground, an unexpected twist tested everything they'd worked to rebuild. One evening, while Rachel was folding laundry, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She glanced over, expecting a text from Mark or one of the kids. Instead, she saw Ethan's name flash across the screen. Her stomach dropped. She had blocked his number weeks ago, but somehow the message had come through. "I know you said it's over, but I need to talk to you. It's important." Rachel stared at the message, her hands trembling. She knew ignoring it was the safest choice, but a part of her couldn't help but wonder, what could be so important? After an hour of agonizing over the message, Rachel decided to tell Mark. She walked into the living room, where he was reading, her heart pounding. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark set his book down, his brow furrowing. "What's wrong?" Rachel handed him her phone, the message from Ethan still open. "He texted me. I don't know how, but he did. I haven't replied, and I don't plan to. I thought you should know." Mark's expression hardened as he read the message. For a moment, Rachel thought he might explode, but instead, he set the phone down and looked at her. "Do you want to reply?" he asked, his voice calm but tight. "No," she said firmly. "I don't want anything to do with him." Mark nodded, his jaw clenched. "Then we'll block him again. Together." Rachel felt a wave of relief, but it was tinged with the lingering unease of knowing Ethan hadn't let go. 2 days later, as Rachel left the gym after an early morning workout, she found Ethan waiting for her in the parking lot. Her heart raced as he approached, his expression a mix of desperation and determination. "Rachel, please," he began, his voice urgent. "Just hear me out." She held up a hand, her voice firm. "Ethan, we're done. You need to respect that." He stepped closer, his tone softening. "I'm not trying to complicate things. I wanted to apologize for everything. I didn't mean to come between you and your husband. I couldn't help how I felt." Rachel's resolve wavered for a moment, but she quickly steeled herself. "Thank you for saying that, but it doesn't change anything. I'm working on my marriage, and I need you to let me go." Ethan nodded reluctantly, his shoulders slumping. "I hope he knows how lucky he is," he said quietly before walking away. As Rachel drove home, she felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. She hoped this truly was the end. Later that evening, Rachel told Mark about her encounter with Ethan. She expected anger, but what she got was something entirely different, quiet acceptance. "You didn't have to tell me," he said, "but you did, and that means more than you know." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not going to let him come between us again, Mark. I promise." Mark nodded, his voice steady. "I believe you, and I trust you." For the first time in months, Rachel felt the weight of her guilt begin to lift. The following weekend, Mark surprised Rachel with a plan to renew their vows. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a small ceremony in their backyard with the kids as witnesses. I want us to have a fresh start, he explained. Something we can both hold on to. Rachel was overwhelmed with emotion. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful. As they exchanged vows, it felt like they were rediscovering each other, rebuilding their foundation one word at a time. That night, as they sat together under the stars, Mark finally opened up about the depth of his pain. When I found out about Ethan, I thought I'd lost you, he admitted. But what scared me more was the thought that maybe I'd never really had you to begin with. Rachel took his hand, her voice shaking. You've always had me, Mark. I just lost sight of it. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Their conversation was raw and unfiltered, and by the end of it, they both felt a sense of closure they hadn't thought possible. In the weeks that followed, Mark and Rachel focused on rebuilding their trust. They started going to therapy together, learning how to communicate better and address the issues that had led them down such a rocky path. Ethan, true to his word, disappeared from their lives. And while the scars of the past remained, they were no longer wounds. They were reminders of how far they'd come. Mark had been doing his best to focus on the present, but a part of him couldn't let go of the doubts lingering in the back of his mind. The thought of Ethan still haunted him, not because of the man himself, but because of what he represented. A void in their marriage that Rachel had sought to fill elsewhere. One night, Mark sat alone in his study, going through old photographs. There were snapshots of their wedding day, Rachel laughing as Mark twirled her on the dance floor. Pictures of their first home, the kids as toddlers, family vacations. He couldn't help but wonder, was the love they had once shared still there, buried beneath the rubble of resentment and betrayal? Rachel found him sitting there, his head in his hands. "Mark?" she said softly, stepping into the room. He looked up, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Do you think we can ever really get past this?" Rachel knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know I'm willing to try, for as long as it takes." Just as it seemed like they were beginning to find their footing, a family gathering threw them back into the fire. It was Mark's mother's birthday, and the entire extended family had gathered for dinner. Rachel was nervous, knowing that some of Mark's relatives were aware of the trouble in their marriage. She could feel their eyes on her, the whispers just loud enough to sting. At one point, Mark's brother pulled him aside. "How are you doing, man? Really?" he asked. Mark hesitated, then glanced at Rachel across the room. She was helping his mother with the dishes, her smile forced but genuine. "We're working on it," Mark said. "It's not easy, but I think we're going to be okay." His brother clapped him on the shoulder. "That's all that matters. Just don't lose sight of what brought you two together in the first place." The evening passed without incident, but the tension lingered. On the drive home, Rachel finally broke the silence. "Do you think they'll ever stop looking at me like that?" Mark reached over and took her hand. "I don't care what they think. What matters is what we think." Just when Rachel thought she could finally leave Ethan behind, she received a shocking piece of news. A mutual acquaintance from the gym mentioned that Ethan was planning to move to another city. "Apparently, he's leaving for good," the acquaintance said casually. "I guess he's had a rough time lately." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't spoken to Ethan in weeks, but the news stirred up a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, guilt, and, oddly, sadness. She pushed the feelings aside, determined to stay focused on her marriage. That evening, she told Mark about Ethan's impending departure. She was met with a mix of surprise and guarded relief. "Do you think that changes anything for us?" Mark asked. Rachel shook her head. "No, this isn't about him anymore. It's about us." A week later, Mark surprised Rachel with an old photo album he had dug out of storage. It was filled with memories of their early days together. Road trips, anniversaries, the birth of their first child. "I thought we could start a new one," he said, handing her a blank album. "A fresh chapter for us." Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she flipped through the pages. "I'd like that," she said softly. They spent the evening reminiscing and planning for the future, talking about the places they wanted to visit, the things they wanted to experience as a couple and as a family. For the first time in a long time, Rachel felt a flicker of hope. One night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Mark finally let down his guard. "Do you know why it hurt so much?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Rachel looked at him, her heart aching. "Why?" "Because I never stopped loving you," he said. "Even when I was angry, even when I doubted everything, I still loved you. And I was terrified that maybe you didn't love me anymore." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She reached for his hand, her own trembling. "I never stopped loving you, Mark. I just forgot how to show it. But I promise you, I'll never forget again." They sat in silence for a while, their hands intertwined, the weight of their words settling between them. As the weeks passed, Mark and Rachel continued to rebuild their life together. They started going to therapy regularly, learning how to communicate more effectively and address their issues before they could fester. Their children noticed the change, too. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, their youngest daughter said, "You and Dad seem happier, Mom. I like it." Rachel felt her throat tighten, but she smiled. "I like it too, sweetheart." The journey back to each other wasn't easy, but Mark and Rachel slowly found their rhythm again. The mistrust that once defined their every interaction began to fade, replaced by a newfound sense of honesty and vulnerability. They learned to communicate, not just about the big things but the small ones too, the everyday moments that could make or break a relationship. One night, as they prepared dinner together, Mark paused and looked at Rachel. "Do you ever think about where we'd be if all of this hadn't happened?" Rachel set down the cutting board, her expression thoughtful. "I think we'd still be drifting apart," she said honestly. "I hate what we went through, but maybe we needed it to wake us up, to make us realize what we were about to lose." Mark nodded, his gaze steady. "Then maybe it wasn't all for nothing." Rachel found herself reflecting often on how much she had changed. She realized that her actions with Ethan weren't just about feeling neglected. They were about her own insecurities, her fear of being unseen and unappreciated. Through therapy and countless conversations with Mark, she learned to voice her needs instead of letting them fester in silence. Mark, too, underwent a transformation. He had spent years burying himself in work, believing that providing for his family was enough. But he came to understand that being present mattered more than anything. He started carving out time for his family, whether it was helping with homework, planning weekend outings, or simply sitting down to dinner every night without distraction. Their children, though young, could sense the shift. The home that had once felt tense and fractured now brimmed with warmth and laughter. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was real. One afternoon, Rachel received an email that made her pause. It was from Ethan. She hadn't heard from him since he left town, and seeing his name brought back a flood of emotions. The email was short and to the point. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I hope you and Mark are doing well. You deserve to be happy." Rachel stared at the message for a long time before deciding not to reply. She didn't need to. She closed the email and blocked his address, feeling a sense of finality she hadn't expected. When she told Mark about it later that evening, his response surprised her. "I'm glad he apologized," he said. "But what matters is that you chose us. That's all I need to know." Months turned into a year, and their lives began to feel whole again. The wounds from the past had scarred over, but they were no longer raw. Mark and Rachel found joy in the little things. Movie nights with the kids, Sunday morning pancakes, lazy afternoons spent gardening together. For their anniversary, Mark planned a surprise trip to the cabin where they had rekindled their connection. As they sat by the fire, Rachel turned to him with a soft smile. "Do you ever think about what the next chapter looks like for us?" Mark took her hand, his expression calm and certain. "I think it looks like this. Us. Figuring it out one day at a time." Rachel leaned into him, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. "I like that," she said. The last scene of their journey wasn't dramatic or filled with fanfare. It was a quiet moment, a family dinner, the kids giggling as Mark attempted to tell a joke that landed poorly. Rachel watched them with a smile, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the second chance they had built together. As they cleared the table and tucked the kids into bed, Rachel and Mark stood together on the porch, the cool night air wrapping around them. "We made it," Rachel said softly. Mark nodded, pulling her close. "Yeah, we did." They didn't need to say anything else. The silence was enough, filled not with tension, but with love, understanding, and the promise of a better future. This story reminds us that relationships aren't about perfection. They're about resilience, forgiveness, and the willingness to fight for what matters most. Mark and Rachel's journey wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And sometimes that's all we can ask for. If you enjoyed this recap and want to hear more stories like this one, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Your support helps us share more engaging and heartfelt stories. So stay tuned for the next one.